Okay, welcome to the next panel. This panel is on increasing the demand for research evidence. I have the pleasure of introducing my distinguished panel members, as well as myself. I'm John Barron. I'm Vice President of Evidence-Based Policy at the Arnold Foundation, Arnold Ventures, which is a philanthropic organization. To my left is John Easton, who is Senior Fellow at the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research. He is also formerly the Director of the Institute of Education Sciences from 2009 to 2014. To his left is Ruth Nield, who is, as of recently, Senior Fellow at Mathematica Policy Research, and was the delegated director of the Institute of Education Sciences from 2015 to 2017. And to Ruth's left is David Myers, who is president and CEO of the American Institutes for Research, and has been there since 2011, and before that was also at Mathematica.
16 years at Mathematica prior.
Okay, very good. We have been asked by the powers that be in organizing this panel also to keep this panel interactive. So we've prepared a set of questions in advance, and I would ask my fellow panel members and myself and the audience, when we get to audience questions, to refrain from engaging in long soliloquies. So let me ask the first question to get things rolling, and the question under the general rubric of increasing demand for research evidence. What do we know? What do we know about the current demand for evidence among policymakers and practitioners? Is the glass half full or half empty? And let me introduce that question with an anecdote about evidence use. So about 5 years ago, MDRC published findings of a very large randomized controlled trial in New York City of a citywide intervention called Small Schools of Choice. It was an initiative of the Bloomberg administration. Citywide, they started shutting down large, low-performing high schools, replaced them with much smaller schools that were competitively selected, and the students had a choice of which school to attend. MDRC did a very large randomized trial. About 18,000 students were randomized by lottery to either the small schools or the large school. And the trial findings published 7 years later were that the students in the treatment group were 7 percentage points more likely to graduate high school in 4 years and enroll in college the next year. And the small schools also turned out to be slightly less costly than the larger schools because fewer students were retained in grade, and so they spent 4 years in high school rather than 5 years at taxpayer expense. So it's a situation, as my mother would say, what's not to like. But it was a Bloomberg administration initiative, and the de Blasio administration came in, and they decided not to continue the expansion of small schools. And when a New York Times reporter asked the New York City schools chancellor about the MDRC study, she said, well, that's one view of things, but there are many different views of things. And it struck me at that moment that if we are waiting for policymakers to somehow understand evidence, the importance of it, and to take it seriously, we may be waiting a very long time. That in this case, even putting the best face on it, taking politics aside, it may be that she saw this study, but she didn't understand how really unusual large findings and big randomized trials with long-term follow-up are, and was comparing it to maybe a theory or a good story, their plan, the de Blasio administration's plan, which was not backed by such strong evidence, and even very thoughtful people weighing evidence on one hand, credible evidence versus a really good anecdote or story on the other. We'll go with the good story. So is that too pessimistic? So that's sort of, I guess, glass half empty kind of take on it. But do you think that's too pessimistic a view of the demand for evidence? I turn it over to whoever wants to answer.
You go ahead, John.
I'll be first. I'm happy to. I think it's very pessimistic, John. I think there's a huge demand in all sorts of education sectors. Large districts are certainly interested, lots of states. I see this, I would say daily, but not quite daily. I see it a lot. I think there's some hard evidence from surveys of educational policymakers and practitioners about their use of evidence, their thirst for knowledge, their thirst for guidance. I can't speak to those particular New York City politics, but I can speak to another experience I had directly with the same administration over the expansion of pre-K for all, where the school district engaged very seriously with a large body of researchers, many of whom were at New York University, who were doing a range of studies about the expansion, some very thorough descriptive data collection, all the way up to a large-scale RCT, lots in between, trying to learn about how this program unfolded and how to help in the implementation of this unfolding. And this was supervised by a deputy commissioner in New York City who proudly referred to this as a learning laboratory. So I think that's kind of the opposite experience, where we see dedicated educators who are hungry to gather, analyze, interpret evidence about how to make their programs better.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Can I take a more pessimistic view?
All right, then I'm going to follow up with the optimistic. So.
Oh, darn. I don't want you to have the last word, though.
Thank you.
No, so I'm maybe as pessimistic, maybe more pessimistic than John Barron is. I think there is more demand for evidence today than there was a decade ago or 20 years ago. I mean, I've been in the business 40 years now almost. And so there is more demand for it. But I'm not sure people are willing to use evidence when they have it, unless it tends to conform with their prior beliefs. So there is demand for evidence, but I think we routinely see that unless it comports with what I want to hear, people will cherry pick and not use it, for example, and it goes back to the synthesis idea we can talk about. The other thing is, I would say, is there's evidence and then there's evidence. And most people are pretty unsophisticated about the quality of evidence, as long as most people don't care if it's a correlation or you've done an RCT. They don't care. It's evidence. And all you told me was you need evidence. And then I think another thing that plays into this is that when there is evidence, and we are lucky enough to have some kind of replication, even a very loose replication, it's often inconsistent. And then people don't know what to do with the inconsistency. And I think the media is terrible about this. They pick up the last study that came along. I don't know whether, I use these examples, I hope I don't offend anybody. I don't know whether to go for a colonoscopy every 2 years, or every 3 years, or every 5 years. I don't know whether to take an aspirin because I'm over 50 or not. Women don't know if they need a 3D mammogram or a 2D mammogram. It goes on and on. And what do we do in those situations with the evidence? We do something stupid and ask our best friend, what would you do? And I think that's how politicians often behave. But I'm not pessimistic.
All right, Ruth, what's the count?
Wow, you're real pessimistic would really scare me. So I am, well, I guess I'm sort of a glass half full person anyway in general, but we were told to sort of think about what is the evidence for this panel? What is the evidence that you have to be optimistic about whether the glass is half full, or pessimistic about whether it's half empty? And I guess the way I would say it is that I think there are There is suggestive evidence that we should think the glass is half full, that there is demand for research. And I think that the point that you made, David, which is sort of a useful distinction between demand for, as in I would like to know something about research, versus do I want to sort of learn from that and apply it in this particular situation. Those are two slightly different things. But I think, and John was referring to this study, I think, earlier, the National Center for Research and Policy and Practice, which is an IAS-funded knowledge utilization center, has done a nationally representative survey, I think it was done in 2015, of district leaders in the 100 largest school districts in the United States. This wasn't just superintendents, but it was sort of, program director types of folks. And there were a lot of questions that they asked about the search for research, the types of research they were looking for, where they obtained research, what they thought about research in general. And I think one of the conclusions that you come to when you look at that evidence is that there's pretty positive statements about research in general, that research is useful, that research informs their work, that they have looked at research within the past year. Many of them could name a specific piece of research or a book that they had consulted. Books were the most, by far, common source of research. Also and I think there's something actually to learn from that. Reports were also mentioned, even peer-reviewed articles, which is kind of fascinating given what we've already talked about today about sort of these articles being behind paywalls. So I think there's a lot of positive things to say there. I mean, and if you'll just indulge my own experience, my sense is that there's really significant unmet demand in districts and states for support in thinking about how to make sense of research findings. And I want to return to that later on because I think that meaning making is really, really important. It's almost limitless demand. And when people in districts and states and schools find somebody who seems to really understand the struggles and talk in their language and seems to be able to summarize bodies of literature and kind of make it make sense and say, here's where the evidence stops, but I know you still have this question, here's where I might make a research-informed suggestion. When people like that are found, they're almost overwhelmed, really, with requests for them to consult or to provide more information. I have specific examples of that, but I do want to also return. This is not like a glass half empty thing, but I also do think this is important to say that evidence, not all evidence is evidence, and I do think that some confusion about different kinds of studies and what you can learn from different kinds of studies and the extent to which different kinds of studies can give you, have a causal warrant, does act to some degree as a brake on the demand for rigorous evidence. Because if you aren't really sure, and if all evidence is evidence, then you can't really hold to account sort of vendors or sort of salespeople who show up at your door or people who have the latest fad. And so in a sense, the sort of demand is not as strong as it could be. And I would have to say that I think, this is, I don't lay this as at the feet of people in states and districts. I lay this really more at the feet of, educator training programs, for example. And I think if we are honest, we have to admit that education researchers and evaluators sometimes contribute to that confusion.
So maybe a middle ground here is that the glass is exactly half full and half empty. I think, my own experience, if I could bring my own suggestive evidence to bear, is that my organization, before I joined the Arnold Foundation, worked with a lot of congressional staff to try to advance evidence-based policy. That was our mission, get evidence-based reforms set aside for rigorous evaluation into legislation and so on. And we worked with congressional staff, we worked with federal programs, and we did a lot of workshops and meetings and so on. That's what we did for a living. And I think most people just, if I'm being honest, with myself, most people listened. I thought we became very good at making the case for evidence. And they said, yeah, they probably thought it was the logical thing to do. Yeah, we ought to use evidence. We presented some of the research findings. And then after we left, they went back to doing things the way they've always done the next day. Because they're pulled in so many, they're being asked to do 50 different things by various people. But there were, on the glass half full side, a few people that really got it, made it their priority, but they tended to be a small minority. And those are the ones that we partnered with. So I guess that's a different, it's not education officials, but it is sort of federal policy officials. That was, I don't know where that is in the glass half full or empty spectrum. But regardless of where it is in the glass, the question is, how can you get the glass more full? Mm-hmm. Right? So that's the next question. What are key factors that are preventing greater policymaker and practitioner use of research and evaluation findings? If you had to identify some of the biggest factors, what do you think they would be?
I'll go first again, okay? So first I want to make this point. We shouldn't confuse quality and causal warrants, because we can have very high quality research that's not making a causal claim. And some of that evidence and research can be extremely helpful. But I do see one of the kind of stumbling blocks to the adoption or the instrumental use of a lot of evaluation evidence, for example, or experimental evidence about treatments or interventions, is something that's been talked about almost all afternoon long, and this lack of external validity or generalizability. Those kids weren't like my kids. Those were not the same people. And also, I think we haven't really taken implementation research seriously enough. Understanding what it takes to actually implement, whether it's with fidelity or at least in principle. We don't know what the impediments are for people. We don't understand this well enough. And I think that greater understanding of the challenges of implementation could really guide some of the research that we do in good directions to help make these studies of ours be more meaningful to people.
Ruth?
So one of the things I have been struck by as I think about how to encourage more use and application of research is that there's a lot of, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of meaning that has to get made out of research for one's own circumstance. So even if you go to the What Works Clearinghouse and you find a really useful intervention report, really, really useful, you still have to kind of think about, well, was that the same counterfactual? Or maybe what I've got now is a slightly different version of that. Or maybe, like kind of as John said, is this going to kind of work in my circumstance? So you kind of have to think about what is that meaning that you have to make of it? And often the kinds of questions, too, that come up in the context of a state or a school district, it's hard to go to a place like the Clearinghouse or to go and find a particular study that answers that question. So just to give you a specific example, before I worked at Mathematica, I was at the Philadelphia Education Research Consortium, which is a research practice partnership in Philadelphia. And I spent a bunch of time just working in the school district of Philadelphia. And there were questions that would come up, such as we have these instructional coaches for technology use in classrooms. How should we deploy them? What should they be doing? How many teachers should they be working with in a given time? There's no, as far as we know, as far as they could find, there's no specific research on that. So they tried to kind of think about, well, what's some other coaching evidence? Maybe it's not about instructional technology coaches, but maybe it's about classroom coaches in some other subject. And how can we sort of extrapolate from that and make a better bet, which in the end is what people are trying to do. What made that easier in a place like Philadelphia is that there was a robust research office there, where there were people who were sort of in between, had a foot in research and a foot in practice. They're kind of boundary spanners. And I think that one of the things that we have not paid enough attention to, we've talked about sort of researchers over here and practitioners and policymakers over here. We kind of try to bring them together, get these people together, work more, understand each other, work more together. But are there other kinds of roles that we need to think about building out and providing more support for? Whether that is a district employee or a state employee role, whether that is more embedded researchers. I feel like there is something there that could really help advance both the production of evidence and the use of evidence that's generated elsewhere in ways that really bring together research and practice.
So you're talking about sort of different variations on different kinds of configurations of partnering between researchers or research or evidence champions or whatever, and the practitioner.
Well, yes and no. I mean, it's sort of trying to say there are people who are kind of both. Are there ways that you can have people who are really kind of both, that are not just kind of, I'm crossing over from here to here, but I'm kind of living in this middle area, and that's what I do.
It's interesting. David?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest factors that inhibits use of evidence is the lack of relevance of the evidence we produce. And I think that comes from both the research community and the funders. I think the questions they ask are not necessarily as relevant as they need to be for the people who are actually trying to do something, for example, in a classroom or a school. And I mean, it came up, Larry talked about this a bit in his opening address. Beth's group also talked about this. There has to be a better integration of the research evaluation side with the practice side. And you don't want to go too far and privilege the practice side too much, because they're not typically going to ask hard questions about themselves. They won't point the finger at themselves. So you need somebody that's independent too, saying, what about, I'll say, you? But I do think the relevancy thing really gets in the way. And then once it gets past the relevancy, if you think about it in terms of the kinds of outcomes they need to know about. And then I go to John's point a little bit about understanding the context. Well, my kids are different than your kids, and will this apply here? And again, it came up in Beth's group, and Larry talked about the role of context and understanding it. Who benefits from this? And we don't have a lot of, most of the large-scale studies, they go into 10 school districts. Partly you get those 10 because they're willing to participate. You hope for some variation. But we know that they're often different than their typical school district. So is it relevant to me? And then I'd say the last thing is, as researchers, we tend to shoot ourselves in the foot because, and it goes back to the translation issue, we do a terrible job of it in terms of making those findings meaningful for people. So what if there's a 7 percentage point? I only use it because that's what you used earlier, John, but what does that really mean to me? Is it cost effective? I just don't think people understand typically what it means. And so we as a field need to do so much better. And I do think, I've even talked to my own communication staff about running experiments on how we do things in social media and try different approaches to it. And then maybe have some focus groups or something We've even thought about doing experiments because, unless we can communicate about our findings, for an organization like AIR, which, it's all about improving people's lives. And we're not going to make a difference unless people understand what we're talking about. So we need to do something different. So those are the three things I think inhibit us.
John?
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on something that Ruth said, and David kind of said it the same. Ruth mentioned this idea of the boundary spanner, of people with a foot in both sides. There may be a district research director who is well-trained, but also is in there in the system. And what this made me think of is a lot of this research use is very kind of relationship-based. Mm-hmm. And Larry and Beth, that's what I loved about your salons. I think that's a great idea. I just love the idea that you're going to match some folks in there who are going to continue the conversation way past your 2 hours together. And I just like to note that there are several people in this room who are working very closely with Evanston Public Schools right now, with a really informed group of practitioners, policymakers who are just thirsty for the kind of evidence to help guide their decision making. And again, these are relationship-based, but we've got some really top-flight people working there and working hard to try to understand how the district makes decisions and how they can deliver strong evidence to help them make decisions.
So now that the panelists have sort of reached something of there's a sense of agreement and overlap in their responses, let me play the role of the skeptic here. Would it make a difference? Does that kind of relationship make a difference? Even if you did all the question you asked, David, are there ways to experimentally test whether different mechanisms of moving research and evidence into practice? So to give you a concrete example here, in the UK, the Educational Endowment Fund sponsored a large randomized trial of an intervention called Research Learning Communities, where they had an evidence champion teacher. So this was a teacher who was very interested in evidence, was trained by the Institute of Education, not the Institute of Education Sciences, but the Institute of Education at the University College in London. And that teacher was designed to sort of be the liaison within the school to share evidence-based strategies. It was focused on literacy. This was in primary schools. A very large randomized trial, and it did not find an effect on reading outcomes at the 2-year follow-up. Now, that's one approach. I mean, that's one particular configuration here, and there are many different approaches to doing this that could be tested. I guess my question is the kinds of strategies you're talking about, should one take the same skeptical view of those, that yes, these are good hypotheses, these research practitioner partnerships, different methods of doing it, training, the evidence champion or whoever, but let's test it. Let's test different versions of that to see which ones can really move, test scores and graduation rates and dropout rates, whatever outcomes. Have I stunned?
John, I'll sorry to
Yes.
Talk too much. I'll go first. I think we need a lot more research on evidence use. There is a tradition of research on evidence use. It goes back to the 60s. It's quite robust. We need to continue it. Now, I don't know enough about that particular study to criticize it, but my sense is it did need some better proximal measures to figure out what was going on. And so maybe we could have a sense of why test scores weren't going up. Were there other things? I think a more complex design would have helped shed more light on why you didn't see what you wanted to see.
Let's do some studies about adding more staff to districts and states to do research. That sounds fantastic. Let's do that. So I think there are all kinds of ways you can say, and it really sort of, I think, builds on what Beth was talking about earlier and Larry was talking about earlier about having partly a science of translation. So it's partly about sort of what are the roles you need and what are the people who are in those roles and what are the mechanisms for bringing people together. I think, I'm not quite sure how you would study research practice partnerships in a randomized control setting. I'm not sure that's a very good idea, but I think you could try different approaches for state and district personnel. I think there's I agree with the experimental approach. When John was my boss at IES, I don't know if you remember this, John, but we ran these little experiments with our news flashes because we were trying to figure out, well, what's the optimal length of text? And if we put some pictures in it, do people click on it more? I will say that I was absolutely, and then we had bets also about how this was all going, and I was always wrong, always. And it turned out it really didn't matter whether you had pictures, actually, and the longer text was actually better in terms of getting some, clicks. And we did some other work on comprehension, sort of how long did things need to be for people to really kind of understand it. And it helped us a lot. I mean, it's a small-scale example, but, we knew more than we did before.
I want to return to a little bit of a point. John talked about the issue of implementation. And even if something is evidence-based and we have a curriculum or an approach to instruction that seems to work, I think one of the big disconnects is you go into a school district or any kind of entity, and that's not necessarily what's implemented. I mean, people like to chart their own course. And often when you talk to teachers and others, yeah, I picked this piece and this piece. I like that. And then I went and did this. And then people become discouraged. Well, it didn't work. Right? So I think there's a big disconnect. We have to understand how to get people to implement. And it's particularly, I think, difficult in the United States because often you hear from our teachers that they don't like the scripting. Right? They want to have that flexibility. In other countries, a lot of times, we're doing we've set up 35 schools in rural Zambia. It's relatively easy to get them to script there. They have nothing else to work from. And you can get them to follow the script, and you do see the kids starting to make progress, but they are pretty faithfully implementing what's on the tablet given to them. So I think implementation is a huge issue for us.
I think that's true, David, but what the point I was trying to make was that using this implementation research to guide us in creating materials, we're still going to get what we want and let those teachers have some agency. How do we understand how to do that?
Can I just pick up on John's agency point? There's one more thing I really kind of want to mention, and that is I feel like in some ways we have actually not articulated in this country a really compelling argument for why educators should care about evidence, and a really empowering argument for that. I mean, I've been really taken by the mission statement of this group called Research Ed in the UK. And this is a group that's been, I think, was sort of supported or spun off from the Education Endowment Foundation. And the idea is that they're trying to have classroom teachers, sort of building folks, talking about research and what it might mean for them. And their mission is really a mission around empowerment, that, I as a teacher, and you can think I as a parent, I as a community member, I as a student, should not have to be subjected to or told to implement fads and whims that don't have a shred of evidence behind them or aren't being tested. And that's a really empowering kind of argument. It's a different argument, I think, from how we've talked about it in the U.S. Sort of, well, if you do this, you might, I don't know, do better on your school performance measures or something. I think it's something we really need to think about. What would that message be? How would we talk about that message?
So let me ask. I'll ask two more questions, then open it to the audience for questions. But to pick up on that, on the discussion here about what can be done to increase, a lot of, I think the ideas that you all have suggested, which are around trying to build better relationships, trying to get people to understand the importance of evidence, and all of which seems valuable. Is there something, to pick up on Larry's description this morning, earlier today, about evidence-based medicine? One of the, I guess my question is, can something be done more on the demand side, meaning incentives, policy incentives for the take-up of evidence? So a turning point, in the excellent description that Larry gave of evidence-based medicine, one of the turning points, I mean, he mentioned that the first published randomized trial was done in 1948, so it's a relatively recent phenomenon. One of the very early trials, and one of the most famous trials, is the Salk polio vaccine trial in the 1950s, which was a national event. 600,000 children across the United States were injected with either the polio vaccine, the true thing, or a placebo. The results came in a year later, and turns out the vaccine was 80 to 90% effective. Polio was eradicated in the United States by the early 1960s. It was an enormous triumph for science and for the clinical trial, in particular, this new method. And there was a big policy change that resulted from that, which was that in 1962, Congress enacted legislation saying that before a new pharmaceutical drug would go on the market, would be allowed to be marketed, the FDA had to require, as it was implemented, 2 well-conducted randomized trials, which was a sea change. I mean, it greatly accelerated evidence-based medicine. The number of trials jumped from 100 a year in the mid-1960s to 10,000 a year 30 years later. It created enormous demand for evidence through the policy process, and you could not get your drug onto the market unless you had credible evidence of effectiveness. So it was the mechanism for putting it into widespread use. There have been some, there's nothing similar in education or other areas of social policy, an incentive pull like that from the policy process. There have been some experiments with it, like the tiered evidence initiatives, which are grant-making programs at the Department of Education, and there's some others across the government, where evidence of effectiveness determines who gets the largest grants, and then there are, if you're promising evidence, you get smaller grants with a requirement for replication. Programs like the Investing in Innovation Fund and others, designed to sort of create funding incentives, again, a pull for rigorous evidence. What do you think of that as a complement or as a piece of the of those kinds of incentives or policy incentives for the take-up of evidence as a complement to the kinds of approaches that we've been discussing?
I think it's a really powerful approach. I think that one of the things that those tiered evidence programs did, first of all, I think it should be really clear that the Department of Education's tiered evidence tiers basically came from the tiers in the What Works Clearinghouse. So there was a direct connection between having those guidelines about different levels of evidence and how that was then translated into a grant program. And then it was translated into the reauthorization of the Every Student Succeeds, of ESEA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Every Student Succeeds Act. And there were requirements put into ESSA, especially under school improvement grants, that schools had to propose or use things that fell at the top 3 tiers. It's not perfect. I mean, there's all kinds of ways of sort of working your way through if you really don't want to take it seriously, or if lots left to the states, and if they don't really want to sort of pick up this opportunity, they don't have to. But I think it's an attention getter, number one. I think the tiered evidence programs got more developers into evaluation because it was an easier on-ramp for them than other research programs at the federal level. I think that it introduced a common vocabulary and began to spread a common vocabulary. So even if people don't fully understand the difference between tier 1 and tier 2, they might know pieces of it. And I think it's transportable to other different kinds of approaches at different levels. So you sort of talked about how do you increase demand for evidence. I think one of the ways is you embed these kinds of tiered approaches into more routine processes in states and districts. One of the things I'm fascinated by is how you might be able to embed this in procurement or in setting up approved vendors lists, for example. If you provide evidence at this level, then we will give you 5 points or whatever it happens to be, and you might have a better chance of being called in to make a presentation and ending up on this approved vendors list. But so there's ways like that I think states and districts, even if implemented imperfectly,
Yes.
can signal to the market, don't come to us and want us to buy your product if you can't provide some evidence that it has an impact. I mean, there's all kinds of really tricky issues in that, frankly, like statistically significant effect. You have to have statistically significant improved effects. Well, what if you have a null effect, but one is cheaper? I've always wondered about that. How's that supposed to work?
So you're saying states and districts, as a procurer, as a user, can also take similar approaches?
That's right. They absolutely can. States can use that for distributing funds, for example, that are given to them by formula. If you've got 21st Century Community Learning Center funds,
Yes.
distribute them in some way where you've got some tiered evidence requirements, at least to build evidence, even if they can't come in with much.
I think one thing we have to be a little careful of is so much of what I've heard today, and when I was listening to Ruth, I mean, it all makes sense, but the education system is so decentralized. And the federal dollar is relatively small compared to all of the other dollars. And states have this desire, and districts have this desire to do their own thing. I know best what's for my children. I mean, part of the problem is so many people have gone to school, and so they take their experience. I think that's one of the reasons it's harder in education than medicine. Very few people have gone through medical school, and so they don't become the smartest person about what to do, the treatment they need. But everybody, pretty much, not everybody, but many people go through a school system, at least through high school, perhaps a community college or a 4-year institution. And so they become kind of the expert on it. I know what works. I know what worked for me. So I think there is that disconnect between the medicine and the education, and that's why we get parents and pretty unsophisticated people making decisions. But I think it would be really tough to get the states to buy into it. Just look at how they behaved with assessments and their own proficiency levels and things. There are all these different standards. I mean, if we had a very federalized system, I think it would be easier to affect it. So, I mean, I like those ideas, but I think to get it implemented would be so tough.
John?
So I have a slightly different perspective on this. I was initially supportive of this idea until I've seen the I3 results, when actually those with the very strongest evidence, with $100 million each, only half of them scaled up. So there was clearly some failure there. I'm a real proponent of the lowest tier evidence, the fourth tier. I have a friend and colleague named Carrie Conaway, who was until very recently the Director of Research and Evaluation and Accountability for the state of Massachusetts, who talks about using suggestive evidence in a way that feels appropriate contextually, that has a lot of input from the expertise of practice, that then's implemented in a very serious continuous improvement, developmental evaluation, testing, iteration kind of a framework. So I see that as much more promising than scaling up proven programs.
John, do you think of that like the NIC, the Network Improvement Communities, Tony Brike's type of work as well?
Yep.
Let me, with that, just so we have plenty of time for audience question and further discussion, let me open it up to questions from the crowd. And we have one down here.
Hi, I'm Jim Flanagan with ISTE, the International Society for Technology and Education. I wanted to build where I think the group is going somewhat of how to empower teachers and principals. And what are your thoughts on some of the short cycle evaluation stuff and allow teachers to be researchers so they can reduce that non-invented here barrier and allow that groundswell of interest in demand for research evidence? And by the way, ISTE would love to help with any of this because that's the audience we serve.
I'll start. I mean, I think there's a lot of I think there's a lot of promise to that, and I think that that's the kind of interest in doing studies and suggesting ideas from people who are on the front lines. I don't like that metaphor, but at the moment that's what's coming to mind. And I think that we need to try to build on that. I think one of the things we need to try to think about is how to help those studies happen, right? How do you connect researchers to that? How do you help them happen on a scale where you can get statistical power, for example? I mean, in the previous panel, we were talking about how we need more big studies. And sometimes I wonder how those things are going to kind of work together. But I think that there are interesting methods that people are trying out now. I mean, there's this interesting thing called RCE Coach, where people are, it's really designed, I guess, for small sample studies. They're trying to use a Bayesian approach and have people kind of think about, what is the effect that I really want, and what's the probability that I'm going to get that effect. I think the rapid cycle issue needs to also be thought through a bit, because some things are amenable to rapid cycle and make sense for rapid cycle, and some things don't. All to say, to me, like the more people who want to get in the evidence game and think about it from all different kinds of perspectives, the better and the stronger we're going to be.
I tend to agree with Ruth on this. I mean, the things that I think about is, again, it goes back to, when you think about the integration of the researcher with the person who's the practice side, I think that's the most powerful model, because you're probably going to get the relevancy, and at the same time, you're going to ask a broader set of questions which may engage that teacher, for example. Not engage in the sense of they feel a part of it, but ask questions about the teacher. And I think if you just make the teacher the researcher, that's dangerous. The other thing I would say, when I was thinking about the network improvement communities that the Gates Foundation is interested in, Tony Brike's been kind of pushing a model that's similar to this. It has this formative element. One of my, I obviously have lots of concerns, it seems, because I keep saying I have concerns, but one of the things I think about is the researcher becomes part of the intervention when you're in there, because you're helping them. And that researcher can't always be there. It's too expensive. So you have to ask the question, as you go through the formative process, what happens when I remove that really smart person? What happens when Tony Brike can't be there? Can this thing sustain itself after that? So now it's the opportunity to submit it to something very rigorous, like an RCT. Without Tony there, the Tony effect, I guess I'll call it, he'd probably appreciate that. And now can the teachers do it on their own? So I think there's more that's needed. You see it in public health probably more than in education, but so.
John?
Just a little slightly different spin on that. So David, what I see is our end goal is trying to create learning organizations so that these agencies and these districts and these states are integral to their mission is to learning from their mistakes and improving. And maybe it's going to take some external help to get started. But we clearly want these organizations to have people asking the right kind of questions, people on staff with the right kind of skills to provide evidence about those questions. So to me, that's sort of the ultimate goal.
I think
I don't disagree. I mean, but leading an organization of 2,000 people, half of which are researchers and evaluators, I mean, I would like to think we're a learning organization. I would have somebody else come in and look at us, because I don't think we do a very good job of asking hard questions of ourselves. I would love to be better about this, and maybe we're odd, but I think it's important to be a learning organization, but to really understand what's going well and not, I think you really need that independence.
so. A lot of the approaches you've been discussed have close researcher involvement in the process of translating evidence. Let me, since everyone is in danger of coming to consensus, let me throw this complementary view out there. In the first area in social policy where rigorous evaluations were done on a large scale was welfare to work in the 1980s and 1990s. There were many, many different strategies tested by states, by the federal government, I think over 80 large-scale randomized controlled trials. And at the end of the day, one of my colleagues, Howard Ralston, headed the office at HHS who sponsored or facilitated many of those studies. And his point, which was valid, just looking at the evidence, was that the welfare to work models that had the largest impacts, and there were some, for example, in California that produced very large impacts, 40% increases in employment and earnings sustained over 5 years for single-parent long-term welfare recipients. There were a few that really sort of clobbered the others. They were practitioner-developed, smart county welfare officials who had just said, there's no reason, for example, why we can't give these people short-term job training or job search assistance and move many of them quickly into the workforce. And by and large, those did better than the researcher-designed interventions. And if you look in education, some of the examples where there's strong, in some cases, replicated evidence, KIPP charter schools, career academies, small schools of choice in New York City, not all of them, but a lot of them were developed by, social entrepreneurs rather than researchers. The researchers, of course, did the evaluation. But what about that as a model, as a complementary model for progress? That a lot of the ideas may be practitioner-generated, and it's the role of the researcher or evaluator to find the most promising ones and see if they can be validated in an experiment.
I'll go first this time. I think it's a great idea, because those are the people that, borrow Ruth's expression, that are on the front line. They see what their challenges are. They know what's hard to implement. They know those kids in general. They see what hopefully they benefit from. So I think some of the best ideas will come from them. And then let the evaluator come in, or the researcher come in and validate. I think it's a great model.
Let me go, other questions from the audience?
Hi. So I've got a bunch of questions, but I'll limit it maybe to two. One is what advice would you give those of us who are training future teachers and principals about this issue? That's, I guess, one question. The second is, as you all are aware, it sometimes takes us a long time to produce research evidence. So what should we be thinking about for the next decade or 20 years that is not being researched now with appropriate excitement?
If I were to attack your second question, I think there are a number of things that are being researched now that just need a lot more work. So we spend billions of dollars on professional development in this country. The evidence is it's great evidence, but the results, if I'm trying to provide professional development, are terrible. We seem to do an okay job changing teacher behavior, and none of that seems to pay out for the kids. So I think there's a great, maybe we have to reinvest those dollars in other ways, but that would be one thing I would go after. So I wouldn't necessarily be looking for new things. I think there are a lot of things out there that maybe we've done one study on, we need to replicate in multiple situations so we understand where it works, when it works. So I think we have a lot to be done just on the basics today.
So I'll talk about your first question. I think I might be raising more questions than answers, but maybe that'll be helpful. Providing answers might be helpful. So I've been thinking about when we talk about sort of, educators in the classroom or school principals or district folks or state leaders should use and consult evidence. Well, what does that look like for a particular role? And I don't think we've thought about that or have great models for that. So you mentioned the idea of what should we be sort of training, helping teachers to do. I almost sort of feel in some ways like from almost a disciplinary point of view. Like if you're a high school English teacher, what should you be keeping up with? Like what should you know when you go into the classroom from research about learning and about organizing groups for learning? And what kinds of issues should you be trying to keep up with if you are an English teacher at this level? So I think there's maybe some content-specific things. And then honestly, I think sort of some basic clarity around different kinds of studies and the contributions that those different kinds of studies can make, just at a conceptual level, could be a huge step forward in terms of what people know.
John?
So I wouldn't, Diane, I'm not really sure, but I think I'd be less interested in teaching teachers or principals specific research findings. I'd be more interested in trying to develop their mindsets. Mm-hmm. And how do we develop a mindset that is kind of analytically oriented, it's evidence-use oriented, and yes, I can make better decisions. So that's my 2 cents.
Great idea.
Yeah.
All right, and we have the last question to this
So
woman.
this is definitely one that would have taken you in a very different direction. So my comment is that the appetite for evidence is very much discussed here around the kinds of comments that Jim Flanagan made. But the appetite for evidence also is occurring at very different levels. So if you look at court cases on affirmative action, on issues related to choice, and you read the briefs that are being presented to the courts, that's where you'll find educational research. If you go to the Congressional Record Service, if you go to committee work in Congress, I was one time at a committee meeting, David, where they all talked about Upward Bound and what you did with Upward Bound and what they needed to do with Upward Bound in the future. So I think that it's really important to have this discussion about what evidence people have an appetite for at the local level. But if we start to build that up, the appetite at the state level, in the courts, in the policy arena, looks very different. But it also, I think, needs to be part of what we're doing in terms of meta work, where we're going to look for how our work gets cited. And I think that this is our future, especially if we deal with what's going on in terms of the internet, blogs, information, how many times people not just are making hits, but writing long comments. The American Association for the Advancement of Science has just started a brand new blog. If you open it every day, there's a conversation going on about IQ, a conversation going on about a medical practice. You can't, and they are hitting every single person who's a member of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. I think that when we have this conversation again, and mine is more a comment, I'm sorry, I think that we have to think about appetites for evidence and think about it across a very wider spectrum than we've kind of presented it today.
Well, let that be the last word then. Thank you for that. So, and the comment is that, the venues in which evidence can be used is and cited and used is broader than sort of the discussions that we've been having about, particular school districts and so on. I want to thank the panel members and the audience. This was, I think, a very useful. I'm biased, I know, but I thought it was a very, very useful discussion and extremely well moderated. So thank you.
Give him a hand.